Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Sally Susman. I'll tell you all about Sally in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show which so often deals with what is labeled the soft stuff, when actually it's the important stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. And when you do it as a leader, as you will definitely discover that Sally is, you do it for a common cause, to bring people together to work together. Sally, it's such a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, John. Thanks.
Great. Sally, I want to tell folks all about you. You are the Executive Vice President and Chief Corporate Affairs Officer for Pfizer. You're also the Vice Chairman of the Pfizer Foundation. Sally leads engagement with all of Pfizer's external stakeholders, overseeing communications, corporate responsibility, global policy. I don't know if she washes windows, but there's a lot of stuff in there. Also, patient advocacy, very important. And prior to joining Pfizer in 2007, you worked with Estee Lauder and American Express. Sally, it is a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you.
And you have a brand new book. Please tell us the title.
The title is Breaking Through: How to Open Minds, Move Hearts, and Change the World.
Great. Is that all? That's great. So you are a corporate communications expert, and I love talking to folks like you because that was my original career. They kicked me out of it, and I became an executive coach. Anyway, so you have some focus. We're going to go through principles of your book, but you have something called Be Intentional. And how do you develop a message that breaks through the noise and the fear? I mean, we always everybody from advertising to public relations, corporate messages always say breakthrough. So what's your advice on that, Sally?
Sure. And what you said is sort of the premise for my book, that it's a big mistake to relegate your communications to considered a soft skill. I argue that it's a rock hard competency, as important for leaders as any other discipline they may have: sales, marketing, inventory, finance. And I tried to break it down, John, into 10 principles that sound really easy, but they're actually hard to live. So the first one is what you mentioned: intentionality. I am so passionate about this because so often people are talking or communicating without any real sense of purpose to it. And so, this all came home for me in my role at Pfizer during the global pandemic and rolling out the vaccine. But it's something I employ in my everyday life. So, for example, when I'm talking to my parents, I say before each call, be patient with them. If I'm talking to my young adult daughter, I say, don't be judgmental, listen. And even before speaking with you, I took a moment and said, I hope that I can engage your listeners in maybe some provoking thoughts or insights that enliven their day. I mean, but you just got to know, why am I talking?
Exactly. And that's as you put it, what am I really trying to say? And it's so obvious, Sally, that we forget it.
Yeah, we do, especially if we don't value this particular exercise. Right. People will prep for a board meeting, they'll prep, for a big presentation, but you need to really always prep.
Absolutely. Now, you also talk about courage, and I wanted to get this up front: courage and candor. And I heard you tell this story on, I believe it was MSNBC, about I don't know if it was when you were joining Pfizer, but you wanted to tell your boss about your personal story. Do you want to share that story with us, Sally?
I will. And, I think of back on that story as being very much a grace under pressure moment for me. I was interviewing at the Estee Lauder companies, a job I really wanted as the chief communications officer. And I was at what I thought was the last interview with Ronald Lauder himself. And when I sat down, he said, so what does your husband do? Because he sees I wore a small band. And with that, his assistant ran into the room, said, Mr. Lauder, The Prime Minister of Israel is on the line. You need to take the call. And I said, would you like me to step out? He says, no, no, you sit here. He left to go to the conference room to take the call. And in that moment, I faced a great dilemma because this was a time in my life when I was really coming out professionally. And I certainly wanted to find a way and a time to tell my new employer that I am gay, but I didn't really think it would be the first question in an interview.
Yeah.
Sat there and I started a little bit to perspire and put my life into perspective and decided I knew what I needed to do. I needed to be courageous. I needed to have candor with this man, especially if I wanted to build the trust to be the spokesperson for the company that his mother founded. So when he came back and sat down, honestly, John, I think he probably forgot he'd even asked me this question, what does your husband do?
Yeah.
But I hadn't forgotten. So I circled back and I said, thank you. Thank you so much for asking about me and my family. I'm really fortunate to have a wonderful partner, and she and I are raising a young child, and together we have a very wonderful family, and I'm so grateful to her for helping and supporting my career. And then there was this pause, and I thought, Sally, pick up your purse and just go. This is over. And he looked at me, and then he spoke, and he said, Sally, you're going to be a great head of communications for our company. I appreciate your candor and the generosity in which you expressed yourself. And it was a deeply important moment to me. I felt that I had to break through, and it remains one of the most important moments in my life, really.
Well, it is a powerful story, and I didn't know. I thought I knew the story, but not the whole thing. So, and that's a wonderful story. And in there, you talk about something about part of courage and candor is, quote, don't be ashamed of vulnerability. So I can see that this might be unsettling for some. Do you want to expand on that, Sally? So,
Yeah, sure. In fact, I know, John, you've written, I think it's 16 books. This is my first and probably my only book. It was a big
No,
labor of.
Sally, you're just smarter than I am. It's just taking all these to get it's no. So you're ahead of the game.
Well, thank you. And just before I turned my manuscript in to the Harvard Business Review Press, my wonderful publisher, I gave it to a few trusted allies and friends to read my manuscript. And one of them was my mom. And my mom came back to me. She says, Sally, this is not a business book. This is a memoir of all your greatest and most embarrassing mistakes. And we laughed, and yet that was very meaningful to me because I have made a lot of mistakes, and through those, I've learned so much. I hope that I have built my resiliency, and I wanted to show folks that you can make mistakes, and rather than being broken by them, in fact, people rally to you when they see you trying very hard, or when you have the strength to share your vulnerabilities. And since
Right.
I'm trying to teach in our field, I felt it was important that I share those.
Right. Now, I'm going to put you on the spot here. So, is there a professional mistake you want to share that would be instructive to our viewers and listeners? So,
Sure. Early in my career, I made a big mistake when I was just starting out. My first job, I was working in the mailroom for the United States Senator Tom Eagleton.
you started way at the top there, the mailroom.
The mailroom.
Yeah.
Yeah, I learned a lot in that mailroom. But
Yeah.
one of the things was I overheard some of the more senior leaders discussing the impending retirement announcement of the senator I worked for. Gossip in my pocket. And I made a very big mistake in sharing that with someone who shared it with someone. And John, you know how these things snowball. And before long, the media was knocking on the senator's door, asking him about his retirement. And the source of the leak was traced back to me. I did apologize to the senator. It was obviously never the same between he and I or for me in that office. But I learned an incredibly valuable lesson for all leaders, but particularly for people in corporate communications, of the precious nature of confidential information. And now I am a citadel. And when somebody says to me, I need to tell you something in confidence, it will go no further. So that's just one of an example that I share.
No, that is a great story. And because you were very young and you learned it. And I'm glad you mentioned that you're with Senator Eagleton. It wasn't the same relationship anymore, because sometimes you just can't claw that back. But you moved on, he moved on, and that life goes on. So now let's flip it. You had some overseas experience in Beijing, which has fueled something you call "stay curious, be creative," and some rituals. Tell us about that, Sally. So
Yeah. Shortly after I joined the Estee Lauder companies, I had the great privilege to travel with the vice chairman, Jeanette Sarkassian Wagner, on a trip she was taking to Beijing. And I was at that point in my early 40s, and she was in her late 70s. Um, and so we take this flight, we land, and she hits the ground running. We go visit the beauty editors, the buyers in the department stores, government officials. And towards the end of the day, she looked at me and she said, what are your plans this evening, dear? Well, I had no plans. I didn't know anyone in Beijing. I was sort of dreaming of the bathtub and a hamburger from room service. And I said, I'm just going back to the hotel. And she said, no, no, no. And she took me by the hand. And we went and visited friends of hers who lived there. We dined in their garden. And for the course of a 4 or 5 day trip, whenever we weren't working, Jeanette took me places. We'd walk down a quaint street. We stepped into a gallery. We'd go into a little place for a cup of tea. And she was making a great point to me, and one I've held on to forever, about don't just run to the office and run home. Don't just go to a conference room meeting and then leave. Take a moment, see where you are, enjoy the experience. And on the airplane home, she looked over to me and she said, dear, jet lag is boring. And I knew that was so right. Like, that's a terrible excuse, jet lag or to be tired. I really loved what she taught me.
yeah, and I picked up on the fact that this Jeanette was in her 70s at that time, so that's pretty cool. And which tells us that you're never too old to be curious, and so
For
it's
sure.
important. So it's actually almost redundant, but I think it's important to reiterate this point: is along with this curiosity. And I think Jeanette was showing you this, but it's also, you talk about the importance of being gracious and kind. And you have a story about your former boss, Leonard Lauder. How did he show that to his colleagues? So,
In so many ways, and he showed it the first time I experienced it when I was doing my onboarding. Leonard was kind enough to take me around to meet all the beauty editors. It was a new sector for me. I didn't have these relationships, and of course, he's an icon in the industry, and so we had a lot of great meetings with lovely people. But one meeting in particular, the editor was rude, and she made him wait. When we entered the office, she remained seated, and we were standing on the other side of her desk. She didn't look up too much. She was sort of in her computer. And after a short shrift, she sent us on our way. And as we were walking out of the building, Leonard said to me, now don't forget to send her a thank you note. And I said, what? And he said, nope, that's how we roll. And I came to learn that this company, which was built by this family, before they had money for advertising, they used thank you notes. They would send one to the sales staff if they had an exceptional week. They would send a thank you letter to the buyers in the stores. And from Leonard, I really learned, both sort of the art and science of writing thank you notes. And he would give them to people in the company who did small things, but things that made a difference.
That's great. That's wonderful. And it's such a simple little thing that really doesn't cost anything. But of course, we're too busy. So good. If
But
Leonard Water can do it.
yeah, and
Yeah.
if you don't mind, John, I'll tell you, I've built a little bit of a ritual around it. I keep
Yes.
a nice box on my desk with, fun paper or cards that I picked up along the way. And each morning I look at my calendar from the day before. Because even if you've had a hard day or a stressful day, there's probably something or someone in yesterday that you're thankful for. And I will usually write no more than 2 or 3 thank you notes to somebody from yesterday, who did something to help me. And it's quite, it allows me to be reflective. It kind of puts a hopefulness that every day has something that you can be thankful for.
What a sweet thing. What's the reaction you get from folks? Are they surprised? Well, those who know you may not be surprised, but is there something you want to share about that? So,
Shock and dismay. I mean, not dismay, shock and awe. Like, people can't believe it. And because the mail is slow these days, even though I write it the next day, sometimes it doesn't arrive for a week or 10 days or even 2 weeks. And so I think it's for them a pleasant reminder of some kind of a shared experience.
oh, that's great. And I will remind people that you are a very senior executive at Pfizer and quote, you have better things to do with your time, but actually you perceive that you don't. So
Mhm.
I love that. Now, there's one of my favorites here because I use this in communication. You call it the pause and prepare. If things are breaking all around us, who's got time to take a pause? Tell us that.
You do, okay? Because this is another area where I made a big mistake, and I write about it in the book. When I was again at the lauder companies, my job was to go out and try to tell the media and other opinion leaders about our products, our family, our spokesmodels. And one day, some journalists called me and started asking about me, and I just started talking. And before I realized it, they had walked me down a path, these 2 journalists, to talk about a very embarrassing incident where I had a problem with my shoes and I got a foot cramp and I had to hobble off a stage. And turns out that I found myself the next morning on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in a story about women's footwear fashion and the perils of pointy shoes. And I was so humiliated. You know, these are not the things that
Yeah.
I like to talk about.
Yeah.
And
Not on the
I
front
really,
page of the Wall Street Journal.
no, no. And
Yeah.
I was really so ashamed that I hadn't done the simple due diligence for myself that I would have easily and naturally done for any of the people I represent or work for. And in writing about that story and reflecting on it, I realized my biggest error and when my vulnerable point is when I'm rushing. And lots of mistakes happen when you're rushing. And so I encourage people to take a pause, to prepare, to not rush in. And, this is a trick. A lot of gotcha journalism, they'll ask you a question, they'll let you answer, and then they pause because they're waiting for you to grow uncomfortable and divulge more than you wish. So having sort of the fortitude to pause is extremely important.
No, it's wonderful, and it's a great lesson. And again, I think Sally, you are not just a communication expert. You know what you really are? You're a great storyteller. I could listen to you. I could keep going. This is wonderful. Now, let's get to some nuts and bolts stuff. The pitch. So you've got some insights into perfecting the pitch, and tell us what goes into it. So.
Sure. And let me make sure I'm clear about what I mean by pitch. Because what I don't mean is a cold call to a journalist or, the elevator pitch, which I'm not a big believer in. Sometimes it takes more than 30 seconds to tell your whole life story. So I'm talking about a quality of sound, the tone of leadership. And my greatest example of pitch is really Ken Chenault, who was the chairman and CEO of American Express, who in the days following 9/11 um, had a gut instinct to get his teams, the whole tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, colleagues together. But his headquarters was shut down because American Express was right next to World Trade Towers. So they'd suffered damage and they couldn't get into their building. But Ken got everyone together. He rented out Madison Square Garden and invited 5,000 people to come together. And as I know the story personally, but I also interviewed Ken to make sure I had it right. And he confirmed that when he was walking into the garden, he was really nervous. He was a new CEO, and his team gave him a speech to give. And he walked in and he saw that there were colleagues who were weeping. You know, this company suffered loss of lives. And he put aside his prepared remarks and he spoke from the heart. He waded into the crowd and, actually hugged some people who needed a hug. And he did the most important thing I believe a leader can do, in that he said, American Express's best days are ahead of it. Great leaders are conveyors of hope and optimism. And so I really laud Ken for creating perfect pitch. And some of the elements, it's about being authentic. It's about listening. It's about bringing your whole self to the conversation. There's lots of techniques I share in the book about how to try to perfect your pitch.
Oh, that's wonderful. What a great story. And anyway, so I think we're kind of leading up to something that you probably covered, but it's important to iterate. And you have a phrase: disarm with humility, empower with truth. Tell us about that. So,
Well, humility is unexpected, especially in corporate life. And I have just found time and again, if I can put my ego down and let humility flow, that I have a much, much better chance of truly connecting with people. And I remember during my work at Pfizer during the pandemic, it was a time like no other. In industry, the biopharmaceutical industry can be pretty sharp elbowed. But during the pandemic, we came together in a different way. And as soon as the vaccines came out, I was on a panel with a colleague of mine from another company, and I heard him taking credit for something I knew that he and I had done together. Um, and the hair on the back of my neck went straight up, and I wanted to, come in and set the record straight. But I knew that it would be more impactful for me to try to just be humble in that moment and let it go. And sometimes to achieve humility, you just have to let it go. Um, yeah,
there's a word for that, Sally. We call it grace.
that is such a beautiful word.
And I love how you expressed it. You just let it go. So that's good advice for a close friend of mine. Anyway, okay. Since you have, we're rolling along here, and since you've been so open and honest, is it okay to use humor in your presentation or your connections? And tell us about that. So,
humor is hard. It's really hard these days. And if there was any chapter I almost dropped from the book, it was humor. It was the most difficult chapter to write because in our culture today, many people feel intimidated to use humor. They're afraid of saying something wrong or that they'll get canceled. Even writing about cancel culture in this chapter made me nervous. But here's the thing, John. I don't want to live in a world without joy. And I don't want to have to be so locked down that, I can only exist in this way. So I've looked to how can we bring humor into the workplace. I have something in my team called open mic night, where we just get up and share our biggest goofs. We at Pfizer have one of our 4 values is joy. And when we talk about joy, it means that we know laughter is good medicine too,
Yeah.
that we take our job seriously, but not ourselves. So once I wrap my mind around the idea that I'm not talking about stand up shtick, um, I'm not talking about being the person at the office party who, is dancing with a lampshade on their head. I'm talking about creating a lighter, friendlier, more jovial workplace, which I believe is so important.
Well, you have a lot of historical precedent in that. From Abraham Lincoln was a great storyteller, and Winston Churchill as well, but also one of my favorite presidents, Franklin Roosevelt. Always had his little cocktail hour, and there were good wit and banter with that. So that's great. So we are racing along here, and I could just keep going because I love these stories, but you have a busy schedule. So as you know, I ask every person, a guest, a story about grace. And frankly, you shared a few already, but I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to share one more, if you would, please. So,
Yes, thank you. I love the notion of this and enjoyed hearing the stories of others in listening to your earlier shows. We did get close to touching on this before, but for me, there was probably no moment more pressured than when I came out to my parents. And this was 1984. We were in the heart of the AIDS epidemic. Most people who were gay lived in the margins or in the closet. And I love my parents dearly. So I flew home to St. Louis to tell them. And through his tears, my father, who is the man I most admire in the world, said, you'll never have a spouse, you'll never have children, you'll never have a career. And those words hurt me, though that wasn't his intention. He was
mhm.
just expressing his parental fears. But through that cauldron of authenticity, my life plan formed. My wife and I celebrated 35 years together. My daughter's 29, and I'm so grateful for the work that I'm allowed to do. So that was my hardest moment, and one I hope I brought some amount of grace to.
Oh, I'm sure you did. And that leads us into something that you call harmony, or we call harmony, and seek it out. What does that mean, Sally?
Uh,
So,
this is the final chapter of my book. It's something I'm deeply passionate about. Adam Grant says that harmony is the pleasing arrangement of different sounds. And I see this as a metaphor for what we need in society. You and I may not agree, John, on politics or social issues, but I bet we can have a civil conversation. But that's increasingly rare. And the disharmony that's out there in the world concerns me. And so now that the pandemic's over, this is my new cause, is finding ways to get people to listen to one another for understanding, not to rebut, to hold ourselves open to the idea that maybe, just maybe, I'm wrong and you're
right.
right, and to help me with this.
No, that's great. That's a mission of, not a story about grace. That's a mission of grace, and you and I parallel that completely. And that's I love that story. So, Sally, where can we find Breaking Through and learn more about you? So,
Well, thank you. You can find me at my website, Sally Susman, SUSMAN.com. And you can find my book anywhere that books are sold.
great. Oh, Sally, it has been such a pleasure to have you on the show. And with that, we're going to go out.
Thank you.